At 2:47 a.m., Katie Rodriguez did something that Oak Creek Memorial in Raleigh had never seen in 23 years of operation. The fluorescent lights in ICU Bay forecast harsh shadows across her scarred forearms as she prepped the crash cart with surgical precision, moving with the economy of motion that comes from 18 months of combat field medicine in Kandahar. Her hands never trembled. They never hesitated. She wore no jewelry except a tarnished challenge coin clipped inside her scrub pocket, unmarked, meaningless to anyone watching, but it was there. The metal was warm against her ribs. Around her neck, hidden beneath 3 layers of fabric, was a knowledge she could never speak aloud. Staff Sergeant Katie Rodriguez officially did not exist anymore. She had arrived at Oak Creek 6 weeks earlier with forged credentials and a single rule from handlers she would never contact again: stay invisible. The papers were immaculate. References checked out. Her nursing license, renewed through a cutout in Richmond, held up against every database query. What the hospital's Human Resources Department did not know was that Katie had spent 18 months in a classified medevac unit pulling soldiers off the floor of Helmand Province with her bare hands, learning medicine not from textbooks but from the sound a man makes when he knows he is about to die. That knowledge lived in her muscle memory now. It lived in the way she moved through a patient's room like water finding its path. It lived in her ability to see what was about to go wrong before the monitors even registered the decline. The antiseptic smell mixed with the metallic tang of something like ozone as she reviewed the charts other nurses had flagged as problematic throughout the evening shift. Her eyes moved across vital sign trends, medication interactions, dosage calculations. There. Right there on the residence for setup, a 14-gauge angiocath needle prepped for a patient with acute renal failure, which meant electrolyte concentration needed to be half normal saline, not full strength. The resident, a third-year named Marcus, had missed it entirely. Katie made the correction without speaking, removing the bag and replacing it with the right one from the supply cabinet. She hung it with the precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times in a combat surgical tent under mortar fire. Marcus watched her work. "Did you catch something?" he asked. Katie did not look at him. "Electrolyte balance. Renal failure patient protocol." "Right," Marcus said quietly. "Right, I should have seen that." "You will next time," Katie said. It was not unkind. It was information. She moved on to the next room. This was how she stayed invisible, competent enough to be useful, quiet enough to be forgotten. No one asked where she had trained. No one asked about the scars that ran up her forearms in parallel lines like a roadmap of survival. No one asked about the calluses on her hands, or the way she could intubate a trauma patient in under 40 seconds, or how she knew exactly which medications would interact with each other by reading the patient's history once. She had learned that if you did your job so well that it seemed invisible, if you fixed problems before anyone knew there was a problem, people stopped noticing you entirely. But Dr. Gabriel noticed. He appeared at the nurse's station at 2:19 a.m., moving with the territorial precision of a predator checking his range. His presence made the air pressure change. That was the only way Katie could describe it. When Gabriel entered a room, the oxygen seemed to compress. He was tall, with the kind of jawline that could cut glass and silver threaded through his dark hair in a way that probably meant he paid $300 for his haircuts. His watch was a $12,000 Omega Seamaster, the kind of thing you wore to announce that you could afford consequences. He had already been chief of surgery for 14 years when Katie arrived, which meant he had built something here. An empire. A system where he was never wrong because he controlled the entire mechanism of right and wrong. His right hand tremored slightly as he signed something on his iPad, a small tremor, nothing anyone else would notice. Katie noticed. He looked up from his work. His eyes found her across the unit, and something shifted in his expression. Not recognition. Not yet. But assessment. He set down his tablet and approached the supply station where Katie was restocking 14-gauge needles, organizing them with obsessive precision. "Where did you train?" Gabriel asked. Katie's hands continued moving. Slow. Deliberate. St. Vincent's, mostly. Night shifts. St. Vincent's in Baltimore, among other places. Gabriel waited for more information. Katie did not provide it. She had learned this in the first week: the longer you let silence sit in a conversation with someone like Gabriel, the more nervous they became. The more they filled the space with information about themselves, the more they revealed. "You've been here 6 weeks, Gabriel said finally. "Yes, sir. And you're already catching things on my resident setups." Katie's hand stilled. She turned to face him, her eyes meeting his for exactly 2 seconds. "The resident is competent. I just happened to see the electrolyte issue first." "You just happened to see it first?" Gabriel smiled. It was the smile of a man who was not accustomed to being corrected. "You're a very attentive nurse, Katie. Very thorough. Some might say overly thorough. Might even make people wonder what you're so interested in checking." Katie returned to organizing the needles. "Just trying to be helpful, sir." "I'm sure you are," Gabriel said. He stood there for another moment, his presence still compressing the air around them. Then he walked away, his footsteps hollow on the tile floor. Katie did not watch him leave. She did not let her jaw tighten. She did not let anything show on her face that would suggest he had just identified her as a threat. What she did instead was touch the challenge coin through the fabric of her scrub pocket, feeling its weight, reminding herself that she had survived worse than a surgeon's territorial irritation. She had survived artillery strikes that came in at dawn. She had survived losing people she had pulled from the dirt of Kandahar. She could survive a hospital administrator with a tremoring hand and something to prove. But that was not the worst part of what was about to happen. At 2:34 a.m., the alarm on Commander James Aldrich's monitor began to scream. Katie heard it from 3 rooms away and moved before thinking, her body responding to the sound with the automaticity of muscle memory. Aldrich was post-op, 72 hours out from a routine abdominal reconstruction, stable until the exact moment he was not. His rhythm had degraded from normal sinus into rapid atrial fibrillation, which should have been manageable, which should have been fixable with medication alone. His vital signs were still in the acceptable range. His oxygen saturation was holding at 96%. But something was wrong. Katie could feel it the way animals feel an earthquake seconds before the earth moves. She was at his bedside when his blood pressure tanked. The monitor showed it first, the systolic dropping from 115 to 98 to 82 to 67. Alarming on every level. Katie's hand went to his chest and found something beneath the bandaging that should not have been there: a fluid shift. Cardiac tamponade. Internal bleeding into the pericardial space, compressing his heart, strangling it. "Get me a crash cart," Katie said to Marcus, who had appeared in the doorway. "Get respiratory. Get Gabriel. Now." Marcus did not hesitate. He disappeared. Katie cracked open the sutures on Aldrich's post-op site while the man was still conscious, while his eyes were still tracking her face with the peculiar clarity of someone experiencing his own mortality in real time. She had done this before. Not in a hospital. Not with anesthesia and nurses and monitoring equipment. She had done this in a tent outside Sanjin, her hands moving by their own intelligence while mortars walked across the phi base. Pain was information. Pain was data. This man's pain was telling her exactly where the bleeding was coming from, and her hands listened. "What are you doing?" Aldrich asked. His voice was barely audible. "Keeping you alive," Katie said. The crash cart arrived at 2:41 a.m. Respiratory arrived at 2:42. At 2:43, Dr. Gabriel came through the doors with 4 other attending physicians, and what he saw stopped him cold. Katie had the surgical site open and was preparing for open cardiac massage through a left anterolateral thoracotomy, a procedure that belonged in an operating room with a surgical team, not in an ICU bay at 2:43 in the morning with a forged credential nurse and a command decision made in 4 seconds. Gabriel's mouth opened. He moved toward her. "Stop," Katie said. Not a request. A command. The kind of command that comes from someone trained to give orders in environments where hesitation meant death. Gabriel stopped. Katie made the incision with a scalpel someone had prepared. She did not know who, did not care. Her focus was entirely compressed into this moment, this space, this failing heart. She opened the pericardial sac and the blood came out in a rush, a dark release of pressure. The heart was not beating properly. She saw it immediately, a bleeder from the surgical anastomosis, the connection point reopening. She would need to clamp it, reinforce it, but first she needed that heart beating again. Her hands, scarred, steady, belonging to someone who had done this 10,000 times in her nightmares, wrapped around the ventricle and began to compress. Manual cardiac massage. Direct. Intimate. Brutal. 1, 2, 3, Katie said. Not to anyone else. To herself. To muscle memory. To the version of Staff Sergeant Katie Rodriguez who lived in a surgical tent in Kandahar and would not let people die if she could stop it. Through the glass that separated the bay from the monitoring station, 10 doctors stood frozen. She could see them in her peripheral vision, their mouths open, their hands gripping whatever was nearest. Gabriel was pressed against the glass, his expression something like rage mixed with understanding. She could see the exact moment he realized what he was watching was not the panicked improvisation of a desperate nurse. It was the trained precision of someone with no choice left except success. Push 1 milligram epinephrine, Katie said. Marcus had a syringe ready. She did not know if he had prepared it or if someone else had, but it was there, and she did not stop compressions while he pushed the medication. 30 seconds. That was all it took to change everything. The monitor showed it first. A spike. Electrical activity. Not organized. Chaotic. Then gradually, a pattern beginning to emerge. Her hands felt it before the monitor reported it, the ventricle gathering itself, remembering how to pump. Come on, Katie said quietly. Come on, Commander. Sinus rhythm. The word appeared on the monitor like a miracle written in green light. 74 beats per minute. Blood pressure climbing. 85. 98. 104. Aldrich's eyes focused on her face, and for a moment, something passed between them, recognition, perhaps. Or something older. Something that understood what this moment meant. The room went dead silent. 10 doctors stood outside the glass. Gabriel stood at the front, his right hand tremoring visibly now, his face white. Behind him, the other attendings exchanged looks that made it clear they understood the boundaries of hierarchy had just shifted. No one moved. No one spoke. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song, indifferent to the fact that a man had just been pulled back from the edge of oblivion by someone who was not supposed to exist. Katie stepped back from the open chest cavity. Get him to the OR, she said to Marcus. Stat Vascular needs to reinforce that anastomosis before we close. She said it as if she had the authority to give orders. As if her voice carried weight. As if she was anything other than a night shift nurse with forged credentials and 18 months of classified service she could never speak aloud. Marcus nodded and moved. The crash cart team moved. The whole machinery of the hospital moved around her, responding to her words, her presence, her competence. Gabriel did not move. He stood at the glass with his tremoring hand pressed flat against it, and Katie made the mistake of meeting his eyes. In that moment, he knew something fundamental had shifted. He did not know her name. He did not know her history. But he knew that she was a threat in a way that had nothing to do with correcting resident errors or catching medication interactions. She was a threat to the fundamental order of his world, the idea that authority came from credentials and hierarchy and the ability to control narrative. She had just saved a life with her bare hands while 10 of his colleagues watched. He would not forget this. Katie turned away from the glass and began removing her gloves, the latex making that distinctive snapping sound, and in the silence of ICU Bay 4, it sounded like a punctuation mark on something permanent. Something that could not be undone. She did not know that Commander Aldrich, the man she had just saved, was the same man who had court-martialed her. She did not know that Gabriel was already mentally drafting the documentation that would begin her dismantling. She did not know that the next 6 weeks would be a masterclass in institutional betrayal, or that the challenge coin in her pocket would become the only thing separating her from complete erasure. She only knew that she had done what she was trained to do, and in doing so, she had made her first enemy in a place where she had no friends left. The fluorescent lights hummed on, indifferent, and Katie Rodriguez, the ghost in scrubs, the phantom with forged credentials, the soldier who was supposed to disappear, cleaned her hands and prepared for whatever came next. The charts were still on the floor when Katie finished her shift, scattered across the polished tile like evidence. Dr. Gabriel had made his point, or tried to. What he hadn't anticipated was that Katie Rodriguez had spent 18 months in Kandahar, where making points meant something different, where silence was a weapon sharper than any blade, and where the people who survived weren't the ones who reacted. They were the ones who waited. By Thursday morning, 48 hours after she'd cracked open Commander Aldrich's chest and restarted his heart with her bare hands, the hospital's assignment board had been rewritten. Katie's name, which had dominated the critical patient roster, had been systematically erased. The grandmother in Bay 3 who'd been recovering beautifully under Katie's care, Mrs. Chen, 84 years old, post-op day 2 from a successful bowel resection, vital stable, pain-controlled, already walking the hallway with her daughter, was reassigned to Nurse Morrison, a first-year graduate who'd been crying in the supply closet 2 weeks ago over a simple medication error. Katie watched Dr. Gabriel make the notation on the morning rounds without looking at her, his voice pitched perfectly for the surgical team to hear, skill-level appropriate assignments. We want to make sure our newer nurses get the chance to develop competency with manageable cases. The implication hung in the air like antiseptic. Katie wasn't competent. Katie was out of her depth. Katie needed simpler patience. Mrs. Chen's daughter caught Katie's eye as they moved to the next bay, a question forming on her face. Katie smiled, the mask perfect, the expression reaching nowhere near her actual thoughts, and squeezed the woman's shoulder. "You're in excellent hands," she said, and meant it, because Morrison was competent, and because Katie had already documented everything, and because sometimes the battle wasn't about who got the patient. Sometimes it was about who could walk away without flinching. She didn't flinch. By the following Tuesday, Gabriel had reassigned 5 more of her critical patients. 2 had been transferred to less experienced nurses. 3 had been taken entirely by Gabriel himself, which meant Katie would spend the next 72 hours watching him miss the subtle signs she would have caught: the patient in Bay 7 whose creatinine was trending upward, the post-op in Bay 5 whose incision was showing early signs of infection, the cardiac patient in Bay 9 whose medications needed adjustment. She could do nothing but document and watch. It was a masterclass in institutional sabotage, the kind of thing that didn't leave marks. In the cafeteria on Thursday, Katie was carrying her lunch, a turkey sandwich, black coffee, an apple, when Dr. Gabriel's voice rose from a table of residents with the careful projection of someone ensuring they'd be heard. $10 as the new girl quits by Monday. She's got that look about her. Thinks she's tougher than she is. Once the real work starts, once she realizes she's actually in over her head, she'll crack like everyone else does. He laughed, a sound like gravel shifting in a truck bed, and the residents with him laughed too because they worked under him and that's what people did. Katie kept walking. "Hey, Rodriguez, I'm serious. $10. Anyone want to take that bet?" Gabriel raised his voice higher, and Katie heard chairs scraping, heard the particular quality of silence that meant people were watching. She was 5 feet from his table when his foot extended slightly into her path, not enough to be obvious, just enough to be a test. Katie's proprioceptive system, trained through 4,847 hours of tactical movement in hostile terrain, registered the microposition shift instantly. She adjusted her stride without breaking rhythm, which meant Gabriel had to actively commit to the trip to sell it, his leg extending further, his eyes daring her to notice. She noticed. Her body adjusted mid-stride, weight shifting to her right leg, and Gabriel's foot caught nothing but air. For a moment he looked confused, cheated even, and then he compensated, his foot came back, his hip twisted, and he caught her ankle as she passed. Not enough to throw her, just enough to destabilize. The tray hit the tile. Turkey sandwich scattered. Coffee exploded across the white floor in a dark bloom. The apple bounced twice and rolled under a table. The plastic tray clattered and settled, and the entire cafeteria went absolutely still. 200 people, all of them looking. Katie stood motionless for 3 seconds, looking at the wreckage of her lunch. Then she knelt. The tile was cold through her scrub pants. The smell of spilled coffee, burnt, bitter, filled the space around her. She gathered the sandwich carefully, placed it back on the tray. Gabriel's shadow fell across her as she reached for the apple. "Careful there, sweetheart. Wouldn't want you getting hurt." His voice was gentle, almost concerned, which made it worse. The residents had stopped laughing. Someone's phone buzzed. A fork clinked against a plate in the distance. Katie's hands didn't shake. Her breathing remained even. She retrieved the apple, set it on the tray, and stood. The tremor in her jaw, the only thing she couldn't completely control, she managed by keeping her teeth together, turning the tremor into something that looked almost like resolution, like someone accepting a hard truth. She walked to the dish return without looking at Gabriel, dropped her ruined lunch into the bin, and proceeded to the coffee station where she poured a new cup with hands that stayed perfectly steady. Muscle memory. Discipline. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. She was halfway through her shift when it happened again, but this time with an audience that mattered. Morning rounds, the surgical team assembled, Dr. Gabriel, 2 senior residents, 3 interns, nurses standing at attention along the wall. They were reviewing Mrs. Chen's status when Katie mentioned, quietly but clearly audible, that the patient's creatinine had climbed from 1.1 to 1.4 over the past 36 hours, trending toward acute kidney injury, and she wanted to recommend fluid restriction and a nephrology consult. Gabriel smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. "I think Nurse Rodriguez might be a bit out of her depth here. The kidney function is well within acceptable post-operative parameters. Why don't we let the actual doctors handle the diagnosis?" He turned to the interns as he spoke, deliberately excluding her from the conversation, and as they moved toward the next patient's bay, he passed Katie's station. He was carrying a stack of patient charts, the one she'd organized that morning, the one she'd reviewed for her previous assignments, and he dropped them at her feet. The stack hit the floor with a sound like a door slamming. "Pick those up, sweetheart. And try to keep them in order this time." The room didn't go silent. It just became a different kind of quiet. The kind where you can hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and the ventilator in the nearby bay and the sound of someone's pen clicking, clicking, clicking against a clipboard. Katie looked at the charts scattered across the tile. She looked at Gabriel. His eyes were bright with satisfaction, that particular brightness that comes from winning a game where you've decided all the rules. His right hand was still holding the corner of the stack, and she could see it, the tremor she'd noticed their first week, the tiny involuntary movement that happened when his fingers extended. She didn't move. She let the silence stretch. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. She watched his smile begin to falter, watched him start to wonder if he'd miscalculated, if something in her was about to break, and then, when his confidence had just begun to crack, she spoke. "The tremor in your right hand. Is it early-stage essential tremor, or are you just afraid someone finally noticed?" The words landed like a scalpel. Clean. Precise. Impossible to unhear. Katie turned and walked away, leaving the charts where they fell. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could feel Gabriel standing frozen in the hallway, could sense the residents' heads turning toward him, could practically taste his shock. The tremor wasn't a diagnosis, not yet, anyway, but it was specific enough to sound like certainty, and that was the point. She'd named the thing he'd been trying to hide, and in doing so, she'd told him something he needed to know. She was watching him too. The chart stayed on the floor because Katie Rodriguez didn't pick them up. That was Gabriel's job now. That was his choice to make. She made it to the supply closet on the 4th floor before anything cracked. The door closed, the fluorescent light flickered on, and her scarred hands, hands that had held pressure on arterial bleeds, hands that had performed compressions on failing hearts, hands that had pulled people back from the edge of death, gripped the metal shelving until her knuckles went white. Her breathing stayed controlled, her face stayed still, her eyes stayed dry, but her hands trembled with something that wasn't fear and wasn't weakness. It was restraint. It was 18 months of orders to disappear colliding with the truth that she was standing in a hospital in Raleigh, North Carolina, refusing to disappear, and that choice had a cost. She stood there for 7 minutes. Then she straightened, released the shelving, and walked back out into the hallway. Mrs. Chen's creatinine would climb to 1.8 by Wednesday morning, and by Thursday it would be 2.1, and by Friday a hospitalist would finally order the nephrology consult that Katie had requested for days earlier. The kidney injury would be caught early enough to prevent permanent damage. That wasn't Katie's victory to claim. The doctors would take credit, as doctors did, but she would know. She would document it. She would have the satisfaction of being right while watching Gabriel try to explain why a simple case had become complicated. The cafeteria fell quiet when she walked through the doors that evening for her second dinner break. People knew. Word had traveled through Oak Creek Memorial like a virus. Katie Rodriguez had talked back to Dr. Gabriel, and Gabriel had gone white, and no one had quite seen him look that way before. She sat alone at a corner table, turkey sandwich in front of her, and ate methodically while pretending not to notice the stares. A new grad nurse, Morrison, the one taking care of Mrs. Chen, caught her eye and offered a tentative smile. Katie nodded once, an acknowledgement that Morrison was doing well, that she was the right person for that patient after all. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Gabriel was already on his phone in the hallway, already making calls, already pivoting to something worse than public humiliation. Katie could see him through the cafeteria window, pacing, speaking in low tones, his body language conveying urgency. The strategic phase was beginning. The real war was just starting, and Katie Rodriguez, the ghost in scrubs with forged credentials and a tarnished military challenge coin sewn into her scrub pocket, was about to find out that some enemies didn't fight fair, didn't fight clean, and had institutional power she couldn't see coming. Commander James Aldrich checked into Oak Creek Memorial on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 days post-operative from a routine coronary artery bypass graft. The admission paperwork was standard: Navy officer, 52 years old, stable vitals, cleared for outpatient monitoring. He had no idea Katie Rodriguez worked the ICU floor. She had no idea he was coming. Katie first saw his name on the patient roster at shift change. The chart listed him as Aldrich, J., Navy, admitted for post-op cardiac surveillance. She read it twice. Once to confirm. Once to understand what it meant that the man who had court-martialed her, who had buried her service record, who had destroyed the career she bled for in Kandahar, that man was now in Bay 7, 3 beds from the nursing station where she stood holding his file. Her hands didn't shake. That wasn't how Staff Sergeant Katie Rodriguez processed information. She absorbed it. Catalogued it. Set it aside. The challenge coin in her scrub pocket felt heavier than it should have, the weight of 18 months of field medicine pressing against her ribs like a second heartbeat. Aldrich had made the decision to court-martial her after the operation went sideways, after the classified medevac turned into something the Pentagon wanted buried so deep that Katie Rodriguez stopped existing as a person and became a ghost in borrowed credentials. Now he was in her ICU, recovering from a surgery his own cardiologist had deemed necessary, unaware that the woman monitoring his post-operative cardiac function was the same woman whose existence he had officially terminated. She logged into the monitoring station and pulled up his continuous telemetry. Heart rate hovering at 84 beats per minute, blood pressure tracking at 118/72, oxygen saturation 98% on room air. Everything within normal parameters for day 3 post-op. Everything textbook. Everything wrong. Katie studied the rhythm strip with the trained eye of someone who had learned to read cardiac signatures the way soldiers read terrain, not just what was visible on the surface, but what was moving underneath. The subtle irregularities weren't flagged by the automated system because they weren't technically abnormal. The gaps between beats varied by milliseconds. The ST segment showed the faintest hint of elevation. Nothing that would trigger an alarm. Nothing that would make the attending physician adjust treatment. Nothing that would appear in anyone else's notes because no one else had spent 18 months in Kandahar learning that the body's warnings sometimes whispered before they screamed. She flagged it in his chart anyway. Elevated QT interval, recommend telemetry escalation to continuous monitoring. Recommend cardiologist evaluation by morning rounds. She documented it in precise, deferential language, the way she had learned to phrase concern since arriving at Oak Creek, always careful, always apologetic, never demanding. The ghost in scrubs didn't make pronouncements. The ghost in scrubs made suggestions. Dr. Gabriel appeared during her 9 o'clock check like a thundercloud moving down the corridor. His presence had a way of making the air pressure change, the way a storm front arrives before the rain. He'd been watching her. She could feel it in the way the attending physician suddenly became more critical of her assessments, the way her patient assignments had been quietly reshuffled, the way certain nurses now avoided standing near her during rounds. "Let me see his chart," Gabriel said. Not a request. An order wrapped in the tone of a man accustomed to obedience. Katie pulled it up. Gabriel's eye scanned her notes, and she watched his jaw tighten. He deleted her monitoring escalation recommendation with 2 keystrokes, the action so casual it almost looked routine. "You're being paranoid, Rodriguez. His numbers are well within acceptable parameters. Stop wasting resources." His voice carried the same precision as a blade, a thin, sharp, designed to cut without much effort. "We don't escalate monitoring based on gut feelings. We escalate based on clinical evidence. You have neither." Katie's response came in the measured tone of someone counting to 5 before speaking. "His QT interval is elevated. The rhythm strip shows subtle irregularities. Post-op cardiac patients can decompensate rapidly if those patterns aren't." "I'm not interested in your interpretation, Rodriguez. You're a nurse. You take orders from physicians. You don't diagnose." He closed the chart folder with a snap that echoed across the ICU floor. "Continue routine monitoring. Nothing more. And next time you feel the urge to practice medicine without a license, remember that Oak Creek has liability insurance. You don't." He reassigned the ICU charge nurse to a different wing 30 minutes later. The backup nurse got called down to the emergency department for a trauma activation. By 10:30 that night, Katie was alone on the floor with 6 critical patients, including Commander James Aldrich, who was lying in Bay 7 unaware that the woman watching his monitors had once bled to save his life and now had to decide whether to save it again. The night settled into that particular rhythm that belonged to intensive care units after visiting hours ended, the soft electronic murmur of ventilators, the rhythmic beeping of monitors, the distant hiss of oxygen flowing through tubing. The fluorescent panels overhead cast everything in their particular shade of false daylight, erasing the sense that it was well past 11 at night and turning the world into something timeless and clinical. Katie made her rounds at 11:30. She checked on the patient in Bay 5, a 78-year-old with acute kidney injury and a fever that wouldn't break. Stable. She moved to Bay 3, where a post-op abdominal surgical patient was sleeping under the influence of the morphine drip she'd administered an hour earlier. Breathing easy. Heart rate steady. At 11:43, as she was stepping out of Bay 3, Aldrich's cardiac monitor began its ascending shriek. The sound cut through the ICU like a warning siren. Katie's training took over before her conscious mind could catch up. She sprinted to Bay 7, her trauma shears already clipped to her belt moving with the smooth precision of muscle memory. The room smelled like antiseptic and the particular copper-tinged staleness of post-operative recovery. Aldrich was conscious, his eyes wide, his body rigid, his hand already reaching for the call button he wouldn't need because the alarm had already called for help. His rhythm was VTAC, ventricular tachycardia, the kind of electrical chaos that meant his heart was fibrillating rather than pumping, which meant the oxygen that was flowing through his lungs wasn't actually making it to his brain or his organs or anywhere else that mattered. He had seconds. 30, maybe 40 before consciousness left him. A minute, maybe 2, before the rhythm deteriorated into something the defibrillator couldn't fix. Katie hit the code button, a single red button mounted on the wall that would summon every cardiac-trained physician, nurse, and respiratory therapist in the hospital. She was already reaching for the crash cart, already calling out vitals like she was reading them from the strip instead of watching them happen on the monitor, already moving through the sequence that had been burned into her nervous system during 18 months of field medicine where you couldn't wait for backup and sometimes backup never came. Get me a 12-lead EKG. Push 1 mg epinephrine 4. I need a defibrillator pad on his chest, now. The room exploded with activity in the way that emergency medicine rooms do. The code alarm had brought them. They came in waves, residents from the cardiac floor, the night attending physician, nurses from the ER who'd been stationed in adjacent bays. The glass observation window that separated the ICU bays from the central station filled with bodies. Katie counted them without meaning to. 10 physicians and clinical staff, all crowding the glass like spectators at a medical theater, all watching the monitors, all watching her, all waiting for the attending physician to arrive and take command of the situation. Dr. Gabriel was among them. Of course he was. Aldrich's rhythm deteriorated further as Katie prepped the defibrillation pads. His oxygen saturation was dropping, 92, 88, 85. His blood pressure was gone, unmeasurable, which meant his heart wasn't pumping anything anywhere. His body was a machine running on fumes and adrenaline and the increasingly desperate electrical activity of an organ trying to save itself. Gabriel's voice came through the glass observation window like a scalpel. Step back, Rodriguez. Wait for the attending physician. You're a bedside nurse. That's not your role. Katie didn't look up. Her hands were already taping the defibrillation pads into place, already charging the defibrillator, already preparing for the moment when electricity would be Aldrich's only chance because his own cardiac system had abandoned him. She could feel the 10 sets of eyes on her. She could feel Gabriel's gaze like weight pressing down. She could feel the institutional hierarchy of medicine bearing down on her with all its accumulated authority and credentialing and power to destroy a career. What she couldn't feel anymore was fear. Charging to 200 joules, she said, her voice carrying the particular clarity of someone who had made a choice and was committed to seeing it through. Clear the bed. I'm defibrillating on my count. Rodriguez, I'm ordering you to stand down, Gabriel said. His voice had taken on that edge again, the one that cut. That is not a suggestion. Step away from the patient. Wait for protocol. Aldrich's eyes were closing. His last spark of consciousness was fading like a light running out of power. Katie looked at the man she had once served under, the commander who had decided her existence was a threat to national security, the officer who had signed the paperwork that erased her from military records. She looked at him and she saw the man he had been in Kandahar, the one who had ordered the operation, the one who had approved the mission profile, the one who had been responsible for the decision-making that went sideways and killed 3 of her team members. She also saw him as he was now. 52 years old, post-operative cardiac patient, 10 seconds from death, dependent on her competence and her willingness to act. She pushed the defibrillation button. His body convulsed once, arched off the bed like electricity had turned his skeleton into a conductor. The monitor rhythm shifted, fragmented, then, for one breathless moment, went flat. Then the next beat appeared. Then another. Then a rhythm that looked almost normal, almost sustainable, almost like a heart remembering how to pump. Commander Aldrich's monitor flatlined at 11:47 p.m. The alarm cut through the ICU like a blade. Katie was beside his bed before the attending physician's pager even buzzed. She'd been watching the irregular rhythm climb across the screen for the last 4 minutes, watching his oxygen saturation drop in increments that spelled out exactly what was coming. Atrial flutter. Ventricular fibrillation. Cardiac arrest. The sequence was as predictable as artillery fire if you'd spent 18 months reading the patterns of dying men. She reached for the crash cart without thinking. The scalpel was heavy in her palm. Cold. Surgical-grade stainless steel, the kind that didn't slip. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory that had no expiration date, and she made the left anterolateral thoracotomy incision in one decisive motion. Skin, fascia, muscle layers, opening the chest cavity with the kind of speed that only came from having done it intense without anesthesia, with mortar rounds detonating outside the perimeter and a Marine's lung collapsing in her fingers. Blood. Copper scent filling the room. The hiss of air escaping his thoracic cavity. 10 doctors stood beyond the glass ICU partition, and all of them screamed. "Stop!" Dr. Gabriel's voice cracked like a whip. "Stand back immediately. You are not authorized." The attending physician, Dr. Chen, hammering on the glass. "Step away from that patient. Get her away from him." Another voice. Another command. The words stacked on top of each other like sandbags, useless, meaningless, white noise against the only thing that mattered, a heart that was not beating and a window that was closing. 30 seconds before permanent brain damage. Katie reached into Aldrich's open chest. The rib spreaders held the cavity wide. Her gloved fingers found his heart, a fist-sized organ the color of raw liver, motionless, abandoned by electrical impulse. She closed her hand around it and began the direct cardiac massage, squeezing with the rhythm she'd learned in Kandahar when a SEAL medic named Holloway had walked her through the procedure on a dying battalion commander with his sternum already open from shrapnel. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. Release. The muscle responded to her hands, to the rhythm she imposed, to the refusal to accept what the monitor was screaming. "Stop her," Gabriel said. "Quieter now." Someone stop her. But nobody moved. They stood frozen, watching a nurse perform a procedure that shouldn't exist outside a surgical suite, outside protocol, outside the realm of possibility. 45 seconds. The monitor hiccuped. A single blip. Then another. Then something that looked almost like a rhythm, jagged, uncertain, but attempting to remember how to pump. Katie felt the faint response in the heart tissue beneath her fingers, the muscle beginning to contract on its own, electricity and biology finding each other again. 60 seconds. Regular sinus rhythm. The monitor stabilized. Aldrich's oxygen saturation climbed, 82, 88, 94. His eyes fluttered open. His body gasped for air and found it. The monitor beeped in steady cadence, a metronome ticking off the fact that a man who'd been dead was suddenly, impossibly, alive. Katie withdrew her hands and began closing the thoracotomy incision with sutures that her hands laid down without input from her conscious mind. The attending physician burst through the ICU doors. Dr. Chen surveyed the open chest, the sutures, the stable monitor reading, and then looked directly at Katie. He nodded once, a single acknowledgement that transcended every protocol she'd violated. Then he took over, finishing the closure with a kind of precision that only came from knowing he was standing next to someone who actually understood what they were doing. Through the glass partition, Dr. Gabriel watched with an expression Katie couldn't read. His jaw was set. His right hand trembled at his side. But he didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout or rage or threaten. He simply turned and walked back down the corridor toward his office, his footsteps echoing in the late-night silence. It was the calmest she'd ever seen him. Which was precisely when Katie understood she'd made the worst mistake of her life. By the time she finished the incident report at 1:30 a.m., documenting every violation, every unauthorized procedure, every deviation from protocol, Dr. Gabriel had made 4 phone calls. She found out later that the first was to the board of directors chairman, a man named Hartwell who'd hired Gabriel specifically because Gabriel never challenged authority or questioned policy. The second was to the hospital's legal counsel. The third was to the state medical board. The fourth was to a journalist at the Raleigh News and Observer, though Gabriel had only given her Katie's name and mentioned unauthorized medical procedures of questionable legality. By Thursday morning, Katie's computer access had been revoked. The 3 nurses who'd been present in the ICU, the ones who'd been watching through the glass and had seen every detail of what needed to happen and why, had been reassigned to different floors by administrative order. A temporary nurse from the agency now covered the ICU, someone who'd never seen Katie work, someone with no context and no testimony. The security guard handed her a cardboard box at 6:47 a.m. Same guard who'd helped her find the locker room 6 weeks ago, who'd seemed like maybe one person in this place who didn't immediately assume she was beneath notice. "Dr. Gabriel's waiting in his office," the guard said quietly. Not unkindly. "He said to send you in." The office smelled like expensive cologne and the bitter aftermath of ambition. Dr. Gabriel sat behind a desk that probably cost more than Katie's truck. He didn't stand. He didn't extend his hand. He opened a file folder and began reading from a prepared statement like he was reciting a recipe. Gross protocol violations. Unauthorized procedures performed outside scope of practice. Endangerment of patient through reckless intervention. He paused. Lifted his eyes. "You're fired, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. Your credentials are flagged for review." Katie's throat tightened. Not from fear. Fear required the capacity to care about what happened next, but from the sheer, suffocating weight of it. He was going to bury her. Not because she'd broken protocol, but because she'd made him look incompetent. Because 10 doctors had watched her do what he couldn't. Because the hospital was already calculating the liability of having a nurse on staff who could perform emergency thoracotomy like someone who'd been trained to keep warriors alive. She opened her mouth to explain that waiting would have meant Aldrich's death. That 30 seconds more would have meant irreversible brain damage. That the protocols existed for typical situations and Aldrich was not a typical situation. "I've already contacted the state licensing board," Gabriel interrupted before she could form words. "They'll be investigating your credentials, your background, the validity of your nursing license. I suggest you find a very good lawyer, Miss Rodriguez." He said her name like it was a curse. Katie closed her mouth. Because there was nothing to say. She couldn't defend herself. She couldn't explain her competence or her training or the 18 months she'd spent saving lives in a combat surgical environment that made civilian protocols seem like suggestions for people with the luxury of time. She couldn't surface. Staff Sergeant Katie Rodriguez was officially dead according to the federal government, and resurfacing would trigger federal prosecution, FBI oversight, the dissolution of every carefully constructed false identity she'd built to stay invisible. So she took the cardboard box and left. The box was light. Just her personal items from her locker, a change of scrubs, a thermal mug with a coffee stain, the tarnished military challenge coin she carried everywhere but kept hidden in the pocket where no one would ever look. The coin was featureless except for a single date stamped on the back, the date her team's medevac had been called in. The date that classified operation went sideways. The coin was the only proof she'd ever been anything other than invisible. She drove to the diner on the edge of Raleigh, the one with the flickering neon sign and the coffee that tasted like it had been brewed sometime in 2003. The parking lot was empty at 3 a.m. The fluorescent lights inside cast everything in the color of exhaustion. She ordered coffee and sat in a booth that faced the window, watching the street that wasn't going anywhere. The coffee went cold. Steam stopped rising from the cup. The reflection in the window showed her a hollow-eyed stranger with surgical scrub creases in her skin and blood under her fingernails that she'd somehow missed when washing up. 37. That's how many lives she'd saved in Kandahar under fire. 37 men and women who were breathing, thinking, walking around the world because her hands had known exactly what to do when the surgical environment was a tent and the anesthesia was silence and the ticking clock was the sound of how long before the next mortar round landed. One more life. That was all she'd managed in civilian medicine. One commander who'd court-martialed her. One man who'd destroyed her career and ordered her to disappear. She'd saved his life anyway, because that's what medics did. They saved the people in front of them. She wondered if he'd thank her when he woke up. She wondered if he'd recognize her. She wondered if the woman who'd kept 37 people alive under fire had just vanished as completely as her service record, swallowed by the same machinery that had ordered her erased in the first place. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was realizing, as she stared at the cold coffee and the stranger in the window, that she'd just saved the life of the one person who had every reason to wish she'd never survived the classified operation that had triggered all of this. And he was about to wake up in a hospital where Dr. Gabriel controlled the narrative. He was about to wake up in a place where nobody knew who she was. The hospital lobby television flickered with the Friday morning news, and Katie Rodriguez stopped walking. Her own face filled the screen, younger, sunburned, in desert digital camouflage fatigues, above a chyron that read "Decorated medic missing after classified OP." The volume was low, but the images spoke louder than any anchor's voice. Unit photographs. Casualty evacuation scenes. A redacted timeline. Her hands felt distant from her body as she stood there holding that cardboard box containing everything they'd told her to erase. Commander Aldrich wheeled himself out of the ICU recovery wing, saw the television, then saw Katie. His eyes tracked from the screen to her face and back again. When he looked at her the second time, recognition crystallized across his features like ice forming on winter glass. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," he said. Not a question. A declaration. His voice carried the weight of 18 months of buried operations, classified briefings, and the moment he'd ordered her erased. The hospital chaplain, a former Navy man with collar insignia visible under his scrubs, overheard the name and pulled up something on his phone. He read aloud without asking permission, his voice growing stronger with each word. 18 months continuous combat operations in Helmand Province. Unit commendation for casualty evacuation under sustained fire. She coordinated medical response for over 40 critical extractions. He looked up from the screen, his expression shifting from curiosity to something closer to reverence. An admiral visiting his grandson in pediatrics overheard the chaplain's words and approached the growing cluster of staff. The admiral's presence alone changed the air pressure in the lobby, everyone's spine straightened. He began listing commendations as if reading from a file he carried in his memory. Bronze Star for tactical medical innovation under fire. He paused. A nurse appeared beside him, listening. Purple Heart. 2 of them. Another pause. The lobby had gone so quiet you could hear the ventilator systems humming in the ICU above. And a Navy Cross. The Admiral's voice on that final medal sounded like stone dropping into still water. For saving a United States Senator's son during an operation that officially never happened. That was when the woman in the gray suit materialized. She didn't walk toward Katie, she moved like someone crossing a battlefield, with purpose and minimal exposure. Her identification read Department of Defense, but her eyes read something else entirely. She placed a quiet hand on Dr. Gabriel's shoulder as he stood frozen near the administrative corridor, watching the lobby scene unfold before him. When she spoke, her voice never rose above conversational, which somehow made it more lethal. Dr. Gabriel. Katie's codename was Nightingale. She saved 16 lives in Kandahar, including the senator's son I just mentioned. That operation is classified beyond any security clearance you hold. She let that statement settle. Your phone calls to the state licensing board regarding her credentials? They're now a national security problem. And we handle those differently than hospital boards do. The woman in the gray suit stepped back. Gabriel's face had gone the color of antiseptic, bloodless, waxy, wrong. His hands tremored visibly now, not the early-stage essential tremor Katie had named but something deeper, the physical manifestation of a man watching his constructed reality collapse into classified rubble. The security guard who'd handed Katie that cardboard box at dawn appeared at Gabriel's elbow. He carried an identical box. His uniform bore the weight of someone who'd seen through administrative facades before. When he spoke, his voice held the same quiet authority as the woman in the gray suit. I believe you know the way out, sir. It wasn't a request. It wasn't even phrased as a command. It simply was. Gabriel left the hospital the way he'd arrived, alone, diminished, carrying cardboard instead of credentials. By noon, the hospital board had suspended his medical director privileges pending investigation. By evening, his resignation had been submitted and accepted. By the following Monday, he'd liquidated his practice and disappeared into a position selling supplemental insurance from a folding table outside a strip mall on Capitol Boulevard, his tremoring hands fumbling with pamphlets as former colleagues walked past without acknowledgement. Katie remained. Not in disgrace but in transformation. The hospital administration offered her a position as trauma coordinator within hours of the lobby revelation, a role that would have been impossible to even discuss a week earlier. She designed protocols integrating battlefield medicine into civilian trauma response, protocols that would save lives in the years ahead. She moved through Oak Creek Memorial with the authority of someone whose identity had been authenticated by the federal government itself, even if the classification level meant most of what she'd actually accomplished could never be spoken aloud. 6 months passed. The cardboard box that had held her dismissal sat empty in a basement storage room. Katie Rodriguez now occupied a corner office in the trauma wing, her schedule marked with training sessions and protocol reviews. The challenge coin, tarnished, unmarked, meaningless to anyone but her, migrated from her scrub pocket to her desk. It sat in a place of prominence, no longer hidden, no longer something to be ashamed of carrying. Commander Aldrich visited for his monthly cardiac follow-ups, each appointment scheduled at the same time, each visit concluded with coffee he brought from a cafe 3 blocks away. The coffee was his way of apologizing for 18 months without knowing who he was talking to. Katie accepted it without comment, which was its own kind of forgiveness. They never discussed the classified operation. They never discussed the court-martial or the erasure or the moment she'd cracked open his chest and brought his heart back to life despite everything he'd taken from her. One Tuesday morning, Katie performed rounds with a new cohort of residents, teaching them assessment techniques drawn from her hidden 18 months, how to read a patient's decline before monitors screened it, how to anticipate complications before they became catastrophic, how to think like someone who'd seen what happens when hesitation kills. The residents took notes as if receiving scripture. The same security guard from the lobby scene appeared at the end of her lecture. He carried an identical cardboard box. He'd learned her lesson well. A visiting physician who'd fabricated patient complaints to undermine a nurse 3 floors down was about to have a conversation about his career trajectory. The guard's voice when he spoke carried echoes of every institutional power that had finally decided to protect instead of punish. "I believe you know the way out, sir." The second dismissal. The second public humiliation. The second example that Katie's vindication wasn't an anomaly, it was the new standard. Katie allowed herself the smallest smile. Her jaw unclenched just slightly. The type of smile that comes from watching the institution finally align with the truth instead of against it. The hospital loudspeaker crackled with a trauma alert. Level 1. Incoming helicopter. Katie moved toward the ER with the stride of someone who'd survived being buried and emerged not just unbroken but stronger, someone who'd learned that sometimes saving the life of the person who destroyed you is the truest form of victory, because it means you're still the person you always were, someone who chooses life over retaliation, skill over bitterness, purpose over revenge. The tarnished challenge coin caught the overhead fluorescent light as she passed her office one final time before the shift began. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes pushing mops, sometimes saving lives in the dark, sometimes standing in hospital lobbies facing their own televised past. They wear different uniforms, scrubs, fatigues, civilian clothes that hide the weight they carry. But they all recognize each other. Katie had recognized herself the moment she saw her younger face on that television screen, and the whole hospital had recognized her in that moment too. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. Some carry challenge coins in their pockets as reminders that identities survive erasure, that choosing to save a life matters more than who that life tried to take from you, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is keep working, keep healing, keep showing up in the place where you were nearly destroyed and prove that they couldn't break you because you were never built to break. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, subscribe to this channel and share Katie's story. What would you have done in her position, saved him or walked away? Drop that in the comments. And if you loved this story, hit that like button and ring the bell for more.